Imagine this. You're out on the vast open ocean. Suddenly, in the dead of night, there's this deafening crash. A ship's torn in two, people lose their lives.
Yeah.
Then, completely unexpectedly, there's an arrest in a foreign port miles and miles away. And that sparks this huge legal battle. A battle that would, well, fundamentally reshape how nations interact, defining the limits of state power for, what, almost a century now?
Pretty much, yeah. It's not just some old maritime accident story. It's really the heart of our deep dive today into state sovereignty and, crucially, jurisdiction.
Exactly.
We're talking about the case of the SS Lotus. It's this pivotal 1927 judgment from the Permanent Court of International Justice. Back then, people often just called it the World Court or the Hague Court.
Right.
In this case, it truly redefined how we think about a state's right to prosecute actions that happen elsewhere, but have effects, within its sphere of influence or involving its citizens.
So our mission today is to really dig into this landmark case, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. We want to help you understand how it set these limits on state power, on jurisdiction, especially when things done abroad cause harm, well, back home, so to speak. We'll look at the key arguments from both sides, the court's conclusion, which was, frankly, quite surprising at the time.
Very surprising.
And why it absolutely still matters today, maybe even more than ever, actually.
Definitely. And for this exploration, our sources are pretty solid.
Yeah.
We've got the detailed judgment itself, the special agreement that France and Turkey signed to even bring the case to court, and the full submissions, like the legal arguments, from both governments.
Okay.
It's a fascinating window into how a really fundamental legal principle came about.
All right, so let's set the scene. Paint the picture of this fateful incident. The date is August 2nd, 1926. It's late, just before midnight.
Right.
There's a French mail steamer, the Lotus, heading towards Constantinople. It's out on the high seas, and it collides hard with a Turkish coal ship, a collier, called the Bozkurt.
And this wasn't near the coast or anything. They were, 5 or 6 nautical miles north of Cape Sigri? Properly on the high seas.
Yeah.
And the impact, well, it was devastating. The Bozkurt, the Turkish ship, was literally cut in two. It sank almost right away.
Wow.
And tragically, 8 Turkish sailors and passengers died in the incident. The Lotus, the French ship, did manage to rescue 10 survivors from the water before it carried on to Constantinople, arriving the next day. Just a truly awful event.
Absolutely harrowing. So who were the key people involved in this unfolding drama?
Well, on the Lotus, the French ship, the officer who was on watch at the time of the collision was a man named M. Demons, a French citizen.
Okay.
On the Turkish ship, the Bozkurt, it was under the command of its captain, Hassan Bey. He was actually one of the 10 people rescued by the Lotus. And it's really important to stress, the sources are clear on this. Nobody was accusing either M. Demons or Hassan Bey of intending to cause the collision. This wasn't malice. It was treated legally as a case of involuntary manslaughter. Negligence, perhaps, but not intentional harm.
Got it. So the Lotus arrives in Constantinople. What happens then?
Well, the Turkish authorities didn't waste any time. They launched an inquiry almost immediately. M. Demons, the French officer, was asked to come ashore on August 5th, to give his account of what happened.
Standard procedure, sounds like.
Up to a point. But here's where it takes a sharp turn. Without giving any prior notice to the French consul general there, the Turkish authorities arrested M. Demons, right then and there, along with Hassan Bey, the Turkish captain.
Whoa. Okay, so arresting a foreign officer on Turkish soil for something that happened on the high seas, that feels like a big step.
It was a huge step. And that arrest, which was pending a trial, kicked off joint criminal proceedings against both officers in the criminal court of Istanbul. This was based on complaints filed by the families of the Turkish victims. M. Demons ended up being detained for 39 days. He was eventually released on bail, about 6,000 Turkish pounds, which was quite a sum. Then, and later, he was actually sentenced to 80 days in prison and a fine, though that sentence was suspended while he appealed.
Okay, I can only imagine the reaction back in France to this, arresting a French officer, trying him in a Turkish court.
Oh, absolutely. The French government protested, and they protested vehemently. They demanded M. Demons' immediate release, or at the very least, that the entire case be handed over to the French courts to handle.
So this wasn't just a local legal matter anymore, it blew up.
Instantly, it became a major diplomatic crisis between France and Turkey. And it's actually because of these strong diplomatic protests from France that the Turkish government eventually said, okay, we're willing to take this conflict of jurisdiction.
Meaning who actually has the right to hold the trial?
Exactly. They agreed to refer that question to the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague. Turkey declared this willingness on September 2nd. France quickly agreed, and they formalized it by signing a special agreement in Geneva on October 12, 1926. That agreement officially put the dispute before the World Court.
Okay, so the stage is set, the facts are tragic, the diplomatic sparks flew. What was the precise question the court had to answer? What was the legal heart of this?
The core question, as laid out in that special agreement, was very specific. It asked, has Turkey, contrary to Article 15 of the Convention of Lausanne of July 24, 1923, acted in conflict with the principles of international law?
Okay, that's the treaty governing relations post-WWI.
Right. And if so, what principles by instituting joint criminal proceedings against demons? And the court itself made a point of saying, look, our job here isn't to critique how Turkey applied its own laws.
Right.
Our job is to decide if Turkey had the right under international law to even start these criminal proceedings at all. Did they have jurisdiction in the first place? That was the fundamental question.
Gotcha. And that leads us straight into the big legal showdown, the battle of principles. Yep. France versus Turkey, laying out completely different views on international law.
Exactly. So France's position, their main argument, was pretty traditional, actually. They said, look, under the Lausanne Treaty and just general international law, the only country that can prosecute a French officer for something that happens on a French ship during a collision on the high seas is France.
Exclusive jurisdiction of the flag state.
Precisely. They argued that anything done on the high seas, aboard a merchant ship anyway, falls under the authority of the flag state. That's just a basic consequence, they said, the principle of the freedom of the seas.
So for France, it seems simple. French ship, high seas, French court, end of story.
Pretty much. They argued that the fact that the victims were Turkish wasn't enough reason to break that rule. They even cited some older cases to back that up. And they also pushed back on the idea that you could somehow localize the crime on the Turkish ship just because it sank. And this idea of connected offenses trying demons alongside Hassan Bey because the cases were linked, France said, nope, that doesn't fly in international law when you have ships of different nationalities involved.
Okay. And they wanted compensation too, right, for demons?
He did it. They asked for 6,000 Turkish pounds, the same amount as his bail, interestingly, as reparation, damages, for what they saw as his wrongful prosecution, imprisonment, and conviction.
All right, so that's the French case. Strong emphasis on flag state exclusivity. What was Turkey's comeback?
Turkey saw it completely differently, as you'd expect. First, they looked at that same Article 15 of the Lausanne Convention. They said, hey, it just says we can't violate principles of international law. It doesn't grant France exclusive rights. It just means we need to make sure our actions don't conflict with established international rules.
Okay, so it's about prohibition, not permission, in their view.
Exactly. And then they pointed to their own law, Article 6 of the Turkish Penal Code. This law allowed Turkey to prosecute foreigners for crimes committed abroad, if those crimes harmed a Turkish citizen or Turkey itself. They argued this law was perfectly fine under international law. There was no rule against it.
And here comes the really clever part of their argument, isn't it? The territoriality bit.
Yes, this was crucial. Turkey argued that, while it's a widely accepted principle, that ships on the high seas are treated as sort of floating pieces of the territory of their flag state.
Right, like an extension of the country.
Exactly. So the Bozkurt, the Turkish ship, even though it was miles from land, was effectively Turkish territory. Therefore, the negligent act on the Lotus produced its harmful effects on Turkish territory.
So the effect, the death of Turkish citizens, happened on what was legally Turkish ground.
That was their assertion, making it, in their view, just like a crime committed by a foreigner on Turkish land. So Turkey claimed it had clear jurisdiction based on this territorial effect.
Okay, that's a neat argument. What about the connected offenses point?
They addressed that too. They said, look, this whole incident involved connected offenses. The actions of demons and Hassan Bey were linked. Our criminal procedure code, which, by the way, we largely borrowed from France, allows for joint prosecution in such cases. And they argued this principle of prosecuting connected offenses together wasn't just a domestic thing. It was recognized in international legal thinking and by other countries' laws, too.
So if they had jurisdiction based on the effects on their territory, the joint trial was just procedure.
Right. And because they believed they had this fundamental right to exercise jurisdiction, they basically said, well, the question of paying compensation to France for demons just doesn't even come up. We acted lawfully.
Okay, so two really strong opposing legal arguments presented to the World Court. What did the court actually decide? Because this is where the Lotus case really makes waves, isn't it? This is the game changer.
It absolutely is. The court's whole approach to interpreting international law here was, well, revolutionary for its time. First, they looked at that phrase in the Lausanne Convention, Principles of International Law.
Yeah.
The court said, okay, that phrase doesn't just mean rules specific to this treaty or these two countries. It means international law as it applies between all nations in the international community. They basically set aside the specific arguments France made about the treaty's drafting history.
Interesting. So applying general international law.
Yeah.
And then came the big one, the core principle.
Yes, the absolute bombshell, as you called it. The court laid down this fundamental view. International law governs relations between independent states. Okay, standard enough. But then they said the rules of law binding upon states therefore emanate from their own free will, shown in treaties or established by common practice, by custom.
Right. States agree to the rules.
And here's the leap, the aha moment. Restrictions upon the independence of states, the court declared, cannot be presumed.
Cannot be presumed. Okay, what does that mean practically?
It means that while a state generally can't just go and exercise its power inside another state's territory unless there's a specific rule allowing it.
Like an extradition treaty or something.
Exactly. It does not automatically follow that international law stops a state from exercising jurisdiction within its own territory over acts that happened outside its territory.
Wow. Okay, so unless there's a specific you can't do this rule.
The state generally can. The court found no general prohibition in international law stopping states from applying their laws and jurisdiction to people, property, or actions outside their physical borders. Instead, international law leaves states, and I quote, a wide measure of discretion, which is only limited in certain cases by prohibitive rules.
So it completely flipped the script. The burden of proof shifted.
Massively. It wasn't on Turkey anymore to find a rule saying, yes, you can prosecute demons. Instead, the burden was on France to point to a specific, existing rule of international law that said, Turkey, you are prohibited from prosecuting in this situation.
That is a fundamental shift. How did they apply this new lens to France's specific arguments? Let's start with the idea that the crime's effect on the Turkish ship gave Turkey jurisdiction.
Right. So, applying this no prohibition unless proven rule, the court looked at the effects doctrine. They didn't actually need to decide if just the victim's nationality alone was enough.
Okay.
Instead, they focused on the principle. If an act committed abroad produces harmful effects on a state's territory, or a place treated like its territory, such as a ship flying its flag, can that state prosecute? The court said, well, there's no established rule in international law prohibiting a state from doing exactly that.
I see. So because France couldn't point to a clear no rule, Turkey was in the clear on that point.
Essentially, yes. The court even noted, interestingly, that French courts themselves had sometimes interpreted France's own territorial jurisdiction quite broadly to cover effects felt within France from actions abroad.
Huh. Okay, what about France's main argument, the exclusive jurisdiction of the flag state on the high seas? Surely that's a strong principle.
It is a strong principle, and the court acknowledged it. Yes, generally, ships on the high seas are primarily subject to the laws and authority of their flag state. But, and this is the crucial but, the court flatly rejected France's claim that this jurisdiction was always exclusive, especially in a collision scenario involving two ships.
So not exclusive. How did they reason that?
They said, okay, the French ship, Lotus, is like French territory, and the Turkish ship, Bozkurt, is like Turkish territory. An act initiated on the French territory produced effects on the Turkish territory. Just because the flag state, France, has jurisdiction over acts on its ship doesn't automatically mean the state whose territory, the Turkish ship, suffered the consequences, is prohibited from exercising its own jurisdiction in its own courts.
So potentially concurrent jurisdiction, both might have a claim.
Potentially, yes. The court basically said France hadn't proven the existence of a rule granting exclusive jurisdiction to the flag state in all collision cases like this. They looked at legal writings, found differing opinions, mentioned some past cases suggesting concurrent rights, and dismissed the relevance of treaties France cited, saying those were about specific policing on single ships, not general criminal law involving two flags.
Okay, makes sense. And France's final point, that the rarity of prosecutions in collision cases showed a kind of silent agreement, a custom that only the flag state prosecutes.
Yeah, the court shot that down too. They made a really key distinction here about how international custom is formed. They said, look, just because countries usually don't prosecute in these cases doesn't mean they believe they legally can't.
The difference between choosing not to act and feeling legally obligated not to act.
Exactly. For something to become a customary rule of international law, you need to show not just that states act a certain way, but that they do so because they feel legally bound to what lawyers call opinio juris. France, the court said, hadn't shown that. They just showed states often abstained. Plus, the court pointed to conflicting decisions in different national courts and the fact that other countries hadn't really protested when states did occasionally prosecute in similar collision cases. All of this suggested there was no universal custom prohibiting Turkey's actions.
So after dismantling France's arguments through this new lens, what was the final verdict?
Well, the judgment itself really highlights how contentious this was. It was a very close decision. The judges were actually split right down the middle.
Really? Tied?
Tied. So the deciding vote fell to the president of the court, using his casting vote power. And the final ruling, delivered with that casting vote, was that Turkey had not acted in conflict with the principles of international law by prosecuting lieutenant demons.
Wow, so Turkey won.
Turkey won. And because the court found Turkey's actions were lawful under international law.
There was no need to award any compensation to France for M demons.
Precisely. The claim for reparations was dismissed as a result. But it's absolutely crucial, as you said, to remember this wasn't unanimous. Far from it.
Right, the dissents.
Yeah, several very prominent judges, including the former President Loder and Vice President Weiss, wrote quite strong dissenting opinions. They disagreed sharply with the majority's reasoning, particularly on the interpretation of state sovereignty and jurisdiction. It just underscores that these foundational principles, even ones we rely on now, often emerged from really fierce debate and disagreement.
Absolutely. So the Lotus case leaves us with this major principle, often just called the Lotus principle. Can you sum that up one more time?
Sure. In essence, the Lotus principle states that sovereign states are generally free to act as they wish, unless there is a specific rule of international law that prohibits them from acting.
Restrictions aren't presumed.
Restrictions aren't presumed. It powerfully backed the idea of broad state sovereignty and jurisdiction, and specifically, it gave significant weight to the effects doctrine, the idea that if a crime committed elsewhere has harmful effects within your territory or on something considered your territory like a ship,
You likely have jurisdiction.
you likely have a basis to claim jurisdiction, yes, regardless of where the person who caused the harm was physically located when they acted.
So bringing this forward almost 100 years, what does this mean for you, our listener, today? Think about it. If the Lotus case allows states such wide discretion to claim jurisdiction based on where the effects of an act are felt, what does that mean for something like cybercrime?
Right, where an act can be launched from, well, anywhere and have devastating effects in dozens of countries simultaneously.
Does this nearly century-old precedent, the Lotus Principle, give us enough clarity for dealing with these complex, borderless crimes of the modern world? Or does it actually open up a whole new set of problems, maybe too many states claiming jurisdiction over the same online act, leading to legal chaos? Where do the limits lie today? Something to think about.